Welcome to Chewing Over the Bones, a series of short conversations exploring the territory of wisdom and insight. I'm your host, Tina Bettison, and my guest today is Uma Girish. Uma is a spiritual mentor and author, and she guides women who are grieving a deep loss to find a life of direction and purpose. Uma, welcome.
Thank you, Tina. It's lovely to be here.
It's lovely to be with you too. So, firstly, Uma, what led you to this work with women in grief?
As with most people, a personal experience, a deeply painful personal experience of losing my mother to stage 4 cancer. It happened 8 months after we relocated from India to the United States back in 2008. And although I was no stranger to grief, I'd lost a couple of grandparents. They died at home, very natural, no hospitalization, nothing unusual. My mother's death really felt like a shattering. And I think it was because we didn't expect her to go so soon. She was 68. I'm going to be 60 this year, and you just don't think you only have so little time with your parents. My mother had also been my father's primary caregiver because he'd been hospitalized and had undergone various procedures ever since he had a road accident and had suffered a traumatic brain injury. So all our focus and attention was on our father, and we sort of thought he would go first. So when my mother was diagnosed, and she died 8 months after her initial diagnosis, it was a curveball none of us saw coming. So having been plunged into that abyss of grief, I had to find my way back up because I was in a new country and a new culture. I had no friends. I was very far away from everything that felt familiar and comforting. My family, the things and people you long for when you're in the middle of a traumatic loss.
Yeah, absolutely.
All that had been pulled away. So I had to find my own way through this inhospitable terrain of grief. And what I learned as I moved through, and what I experienced personally, and how I evolved through that entire experience made me realize that grief isn't the enemy. And I wanted to share that message with more women because I love working with women, especially in a culture that is so grief avoidant.
Yeah, and you speak about grief as a companion. In fact, I think you've even called her your sister. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I like to call her Sister Grief because I think she walks beside me and everyone really. But the way I perceive her is that she's like a sister walking beside me. We typically tend to think of grief as it relates to the big losses in life, the death of someone we love, financial bankruptcy, the loss of a job, the end of a relationship. But I think we don't honor the small griefs in our everyday lives. And there are so many small losses that we grieve every single day. It could be how you were treated at a grocery store checkout by the clerk. Maybe they said something rude to you and you felt hurt. Maybe your boss passed you over for a particular project you had your eye on. Maybe someone disappointed you. Someone you had a certain expectation of didn't come to the table. There are so many losses that are small, but we push them away because we think we only have permission to grieve the big losses. So I call her Sister Grief because she reminds me to honor every small loss in life. The simple everyday losses that I move through could be a spat with my husband, which makes me cry. And I have to grieve that. I have to grieve that I had a certain expectation that went unfulfilled, and I experienced something inside of me. And it's completely valid for me to honor that, to name it, to feel it, to grieve it. So I often like to say, I invite Sister Grief for a conversation. I pour her a cup of tea and we sit and have a nice little chat. And she listens to me as I tell her what I'm feeling, as I tell her how much it hurts. We talk about what my expectations were, how I was disappointed. And much, much later, only once all the feelings are dissolved do we get to the lesson and the wisdom. Because the tendency is to look for the lesson and the wisdom before we are finished with our feelings. And I think we really need to make space and time, as much time as we need, to feel what wants to be felt.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think that one of the things that we struggle with a lot, particularly in Western cultures, and I'd be interested to know your experience from an Indian culture, is we feel like we should be over it in a few days. Or if it's a small thing, well, we shouldn't be grieving about that. You know, that we want to kind of package it up and push it aside and kind of get on with life. And and if it's the bigger losses, that, well, we have a period of time, usually perhaps up to and just after the funeral, perhaps, and then we should be all right after that. We should be able to go back to work and get on with life. And it just doesn't work like that, does it? And I
It
know
doesn't.
from some of my own experiences, you can be in a conversation with somebody talking about something entirely different, and then it kind of comes around to something, and then it just sparks off that that trigger, whatever it is, and then whoosh, out
Yeah.
it all comes. And we get so embarrassed about those moments, and yet they are so important.
Mhm. I think that's primarily because Western culture has a very low tolerance for
Mm.
anything unpleasant. Everyone wants to be happy, high-spirited. Let's celebrate, let's have fun. The emphasis is on feeling good and feeling well at all times. But as we know, this human journey involves pain, sadness, resentment, grief, guilt,
Oh, yes.
all of that, plenty of it. So when we don't make time, and we don't make time because we also live in a culture that doesn't honor the seasons. We are cyclical beings.
Mm.
We move through seasons just as much as nature does. But we've forgotten that in a world that worships clocks and calendars and everything is digital and instant gratification is the name of the game. Well, when it comes to grieving, there is no instant gratification. You can't push a button and move past it. It takes
Yeah.
as much time as it does. The other reason I believe we don't know how to grieve is because many people grew up in emotionally illiterate families.
Mm.
Grieving a loss wasn't modeled by parents or grandparents because they were the survival generation. They just had to get on with it. There was no space or time to grieve. They had to get up and go to work because not going to work meant no food on the table. They didn't have the luxury that we do, actually, in many ways, where we have so much literature available to us. We have therapists, we have courses, we have teachers, we have spiritual communities, all of which are spaces that can hold us when we are grieving or moving through a transition. But our parents didn't have that luxury. And so the only thing they knew how to teach us was shut it down
Yeah,
and just keep
absolutely.
moving.
Mm. And of course, there was a stage, perhaps I think perhaps in the Victorian era, where you wore certain colours at certain stages of grieving. You would wear black for a year, for example, and then you would, I think, lilac or lavender or sort of pale purpley colour was then what you then moved into. But it gave a sense of, to other people, you are in a period of mourning. We don't do that kind of thing now, do we?
No, we don't. I mean, even in India, we have rituals, we have elaborate ceremonies that mark the period of loss and grief. When my mother died, we took 2 whole weeks. Every day there was a ritual performed, and at the end of the 2 week period, we have a feast. Family and close friends are invited. There's a priest who speaks about the person who passed away. So it's a celebration, it's mourning, it's a mix of everything, just like life is. And then for a whole year after that, we don't have any weddings in the family, we don't celebrate any festivals. So the first year after we lose a loved one is officially a period of mourning. So it gives us that framework to move through the emotions that come up, which in the absence of rituals and a framework, in the Western culture, people are rushed into regular life. They struggle with that. They don't perform as well as they expected to. And that's why I think we have so much more trauma and mental illness, because unacknowledged grief is one of the loudest voices inside of us.
Yeah, indeed. So what do you think the wisdom in grief is, or what from your experience has been the wisdom that has come to you through grief?
I believe that loss and grief remind us of impermanence. We're not going to be here forever. Nothing that lives is going to be here forever. And this reminder of impermanence is actually an invitation to live life more fully, to experience the joys that are here, to be more mindful of our connections, our intimate partnerships, and so on. I also think that we can't do for others what we can't do for ourselves. So the more present we are to our own experiences, the more empathy we have for what someone else is suffering. So if we shut down our personal grief, then we are going to shut down to other people's grief as well. We are going to judge them and criticize them because we believe it's wrong to spend so much time on grieving. So giving to ourselves is actually the thing that opens our hearts to make us more available and present to others. And isn't that what this life is all about? That we're here to companion each other on this very hard journey. So I think that's really what grief taught me. It also, going back to the impermanence piece, it also taught me to get really clear and urgent about my legacy. I don't have all the time in the world. So where I put my time and energy needs to be congruent with what I feel is purposeful and meaningful. Yeah.
Brilliant. I think that's a beautiful place to leave our little conversation. Uma, thank you so much for sharing that with me and being with me today.
Oh, I love this. Thank you so much, Tina.
I hope you enjoyed my short conversation with Uma. If you'd like to know more about her work or mine, all the details are coming up next.